It was a quiet Tuesday evening in the small town of Maplewood, where life usually moved at a slow and predictable pace. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple. Officer Kyle Bennett sat in his patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee from a paper cup. His shift was almost over, but he knew better than to let his guard down just yet. Things could change in an instant, even in a place as sleepy as this. Kyle wasn't new to the job. He'd been wearing the uniform for nearly 10 years now, long enough to feel like he knew everything there was to know about policing. But tonight, something felt different, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Maybe it was the way the shadows stretched across the empty streets, or how the wind carried an unfamiliar chill. Whatever it was, it made him uneasy. As he turned onto Main Street, a silver sedan caught his attention. It was speeding past the intersection, its tires screeching slightly as it ran a red light. Kyle frowned and reached for the radio to call it in before flipping on his sirens. The sedan slowed down reluctantly, pulling over to the side of the road. Kyle grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the gravel. The driver's window rolled down slowly, revealing a young woman with dark skin and sharp features. Her hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and she wore glasses that gave her an air of professionalism. She looked nervous, gripping the steering wheel tightly as Kyle approached. "Good evening, ma'am," Kyle said, shining his flashlight into the car. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" The woman nodded quickly, her voice steady despite her obvious tension. "Yes, officer. I'm sorry. I didn't see the light turn red. I was rushing because I have an important meeting." Kyle studied her face carefully. There was something about her tone, maybe even her appearance, that triggered a flicker of discomfort inside him. He didn't want to admit it, not even to himself, but there were moments when his judgment got clouded by biases he thought he'd buried long ago. Tonight, those biases seemed louder than usual. "License and registration, please," Kyle said, his tone firmer than necessary. The woman fumbled through her purse before handing over the requested documents. Her name was Lisa Grant, according to her driver's license. Kyle glanced at it briefly before stepping back to his patrol car to run the information through the system. Everything checked out. No warrants, no outstanding tickets. Still, something about her demeanor irked him. Why did she seem so defensive? Was she hiding something? When Kyle returned to the sedan, his questions grew sharper. "Where are you headed, Ms. Grant?" "I told you already," Lisa replied, her patience starting to wear thin. "I'm late for a meeting. If you could hurry this up, I'd appreciate it." Her tone struck a nerve. Kyle bristled, leaning closer to the window. "You're not in much of a position to make demands here, ma'am. You broke the law, and I'm doing my job." Lisa sighed, clearly frustrated. "Look, I admitted I made a mistake. I apologized. What more do you want from me?" But Kyle wasn't listening anymore. Instead, he focused on the way she spoke, the slight accent in her voice, the confidence in her words. To him, it all felt off, like she was challenging his authority. Without realizing it, he began raising his voice, accusing her of being evasive and uncooperative. "You need to calm down," Lisa said firmly, her eyes locking onto his. "I haven't done anything wrong except run a red light. Are we really going to escalate this over something so minor?" "Minor?" Kyle's jaw tightened. How dare she dismiss his concerns like that? In his mind, her attitude confirmed what he feared most, that she thought she was above the rules. His frustration boiled over, and before he knew it, he was reaching for his handcuffs. "Step out of the vehicle, please," Kyle ordered, his voice cold and clipped. Lisa stared at him in disbelief. "What? Why? This is ridiculous." "Ma'am, if you don't comply, I'll have no choice but to arrest you for obstruction," Kyle shot back, his hand resting on the grip of his holster. For a moment, Lisa considered arguing further, but she decided against it. Reluctantly, she stepped out of the car, her hands raised slightly in surrender. As Kyle cuffed her and placed her in the back of his patrol car, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But not about her, about himself. Unbeknownst to Kyle, Lisa Grant wasn't just any civilian. She was a federal inspector general, tasked with investigating allegations of racial bias within law enforcement agencies across the country. For weeks, she had been conducting undercover operations in towns like Maplewood, gathering evidence to expose systemic issues plaguing communities nationwide. But Kyle hadn't asked for additional identification beyond her driver's license, and even if he had, Lisa carried no official badge during these missions. As they drove toward the station, Lisa remained silent, her mind racing. She had expected resistance during her work, but nothing quite like this. Kyle's behavior was textbook, an example of the very problem she was trying to address. Yet instead of anger, she felt a strange mix of sadness and determination. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been treated unfairly because of their race, accent, or appearance. Back at the station, Kyle processed Lisa's paperwork mechanically, avoiding eye contact as much as possible. Deep down he knew he'd crossed a line, but pride kept him from admitting it. He told himself he was following protocol, protecting the community. But the nagging doubt lingered, whispering truths he wasn't ready to face. Little did Kyle realize, this encounter would set off a chain of events neither of them could have anticipated. What started as a routine traffic stop would soon spiral into a courtroom drama, forcing both individuals to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and the world they lived in. And while Kyle might have believed he was in control, fate had other plans for him, for Lisa, and for everyone watching closely from the sidelines. That night, as Kyle finally ended his shift and drove home, he replayed the incident in his head. Something about Lisa's calm defiance haunted him, refusing to fade away. Try as he might, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd made a grave mistake, one that would come back to haunt him sooner rather than later. The next morning, Kyle Bennett woke up with a heavy feeling in his chest. He had tossed and turned all night, replaying the events of the traffic stop over and over in his mind. Something about the way Lisa Grant had looked at him, calm but piercing, stayed with him. He tried to convince himself that he had done nothing wrong, that he was simply enforcing the law. But deep down, he couldn't ignore the nagging doubt that maybe, just maybe, he had let his emotions get the better of him. At the police station, things seemed normal enough. His colleagues greeted him as usual, and the morning briefing passed, without incident. But when Captain Alan Carter called him into his office, Kyle's stomach tightened. Carter wasn't the kind of man who wasted time on small talk. If he wanted to see you, it was usually because something serious was going on. "Close the door," Carter said as Kyle entered. The older man sat behind his desk, his face unreadable. On the table in front of him was a thin folder, its contents hidden from view. Kyle hesitated for a moment before obeying, his heart pounding. "You're probably wondering why I called you in here," Carter began, leaning back in his chair. "It's about last night, that arrest you made." Kyle shifted uncomfortably. "What about it?" Carter opened the folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. "This came in early this morning. It's a notice from the Department of Justice. The woman you arrested? She's not just some civilian. Her name is Lisa Grant, and she's a federal inspector general." Kyle's eyes widened. "A what?" "You heard me," Carter said, his tone sharp. "She's been conducting an undercover investigation into allegations of racial bias within law enforcement agencies. Your little traffic stop? It's now part of her case." Kyle felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. His mind raced as he tried to process what he was hearing. "But she didn't say anything. How was I supposed to know?" "That's not the point," Carter snapped. "The point is your actions are being scrutinized now. And if her report paints you in a bad light, it's not just you who'll take the hit. It's the whole department." Kyle sank into the chair opposite Carter, his head spinning. He wanted to argue, to explain that he hadn't meant any harm, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he stared at the paper on the desk, his hands clenched into fists. Later that day, Kyle found himself sitting in a courtroom, waiting for the hearing to begin. The room was quiet except for the low murmur of voices and the occasional shuffle of papers. Kyle glanced around nervously, taking in the rows of empty seats and the imposing figure of the judge seated at the front. He had never been particularly fond of courtrooms. They always made him feel exposed, vulnerable. When Lisa Grant walked in, Kyle's breath caught in his throat. She looked different today, more composed somehow. Gone was the nervousness he had seen in the car. Instead, she carried herself with an air of quiet confidence that made him uneasy. She took her seat beside her attorney, a tall man with silver hair and a no-nonsense expression, and began flipping through a stack of documents. As the proceedings got underway, Kyle listened intently as the prosecutor outlined the charges against Lisa. According to the report, she had been pulled over for running a red light, then arrested for obstruction after failing to comply with Officer Bennett's orders. Kyle winced at the word obstruction. It sounded so harsh, so final. When it was his turn to testify, Kyle stood up reluctantly, his palms sweaty. Under oath, he recounted the events of the traffic stop, sticking closely to the facts, or at least what he believed were the facts. He described how Lisa had run the red light, how she had seemed evasive during questioning, and how her refusal to cooperate had left him with no choice but to arrest her. Throughout his testimony, Lisa watched him silently, her expression unreadable. Kyle avoided meeting her gaze, focusing instead on the judge and the prosecutor. By the time he finished speaking, he felt drained, as though he had relived the entire ordeal all over again. Then it was Lisa's turn to speak. She rose from her seat gracefully, her voice calm and measured as she addressed the court. "Your Honor," she began, "I'd like to clarify my position. Yes, I ran a red light. It was careless, and I take full responsibility for that. However, the events that followed were not about traffic violations. They were about bias, implicit or otherwise, and how it affects interactions between law enforcement and members of marginalized communities." The courtroom fell silent as Lisa continued. "Officer Bennett's behavior during our encounter reflects patterns I have observed throughout my investigation. Patterns that suggest systemic issues within law enforcement agencies nationwide. This case is not about me. It's about exposing those issues so we can work toward meaningful change." Kyle felt his face flush with embarrassment as Lisa spoke. He wanted to interrupt, to defend himself, but he knew it wouldn't do any good. Instead, he sat there frozen, as the weight of her words settled over him. When Lisa finished, the judge thanked her and adjourned the hearing until further evidence could be reviewed. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Kyle lingered, unsure of what to do next. He felt like a stranger in his own life, caught between the person he thought he was and the person Lisa's testimony suggested he might be. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, eager for sound bites and reactions. Kyle ducked his head and hurried to his car, avoiding their questions. He didn't want to talk to anyone, not the press, not his colleagues, not even his family. All he wanted was to go home and forget the day had ever happened. But forgetting wasn't an option. Not anymore. That evening, as Kyle sat alone in his living room, he pulled out his phone and searched for information about Lisa Grant. What he found shocked him. Articles, interviews, official statements, all of them painted a picture of a woman dedicated to justice, someone who had spent years fighting for fairness and equality. Kyle realized then that he had underestimated her, dismissed her without even trying to understand who she was or what she stood for. For the first time in a long time, Kyle allowed himself to reflect on his own beliefs and behaviors. He thought about the countless interactions he'd had with people over the years, the ones he had judged too quickly, the assumptions he had made without thinking twice. Was it possible that he had contributed to the very problems Lisa was trying to address? The thought weighed heavily on him, filling him with a mix of guilt and determination. He didn't know what the future held, whether Lisa's investigation would lead to consequences for him personally or for the department as a whole. But one thing was clear. He couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. If he wanted to make amends, he would have to start by facing the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. And so, as the sun set outside his window, Kyle resolved to take the first step. It wouldn't be easy, and it certainly wouldn't happen overnight. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to try, to listen, to learn, and maybe, just maybe, to change. Days following the hearing were some of the hardest Kyle Bennett had ever faced. Every morning he woke up dreading what might come next. Would there be more questions from his superiors? More scrutiny from the public? Or worse. Would Lisa? Grant's investigation revealed something that could end his career. He felt like he was walking on thin ice, unsure of where to step or how to move forward. At the precinct, things weren't much better. His colleagues avoided talking about the case directly, but Kyle could feel their eyes on him whenever he walked into a room. Some gave him sympathetic looks, while others seemed judgmental, as if they already knew he had messed up. Captain Allen. Carter called him into his office again, this time with a stern warning. "You're under a microscope now, Kyle," Carter said, his voice low but firm. "Lisa Grant is thorough. She'll dig into everything, your record, your behavior, even your personal life. If there's anything that doesn't look good, it's going to come out. So, I suggest you start reflecting on your actions and thinking about how you can improve." Kyle nodded, though he didn't trust himself to speak. He knew Carter was right, but the thought of having every decision he'd ever made scrutinized made him feel sick. Still, he couldn't deny that he needed to take responsibility for what had happened. The problem was, he wasn't sure where to begin. Later that week, Lisa Grant arrived at the police station to conduct interviews with officers involved in her investigation. When Kyle saw her walk through the door, his stomach twisted into knots. She looked the same as she had in court, calm, composed, and professional, but there was also an intensity in her gaze that made him uneasy. For a moment he considered avoiding her altogether, but he knew that wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he forced himself to approach her. "Ms. Grant," he said awkwardly, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Can we talk?" Lisa studied him for a moment before nodding. "Sure. Let's go somewhere quiet." They found an empty meeting room and sat down across from each other. Kyle fidgeted nervously, unsure of how to start. Finally, he took a deep breath and spoke. "I want to apologize," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for what happened during the traffic stop. I realize now that I handled things poorly. I let my biases get in the way, and I'm sorry." Lisa listened without interrupting, her expression neutral. When Kyle finished, she leaned back in her chair and regarded him thoughtfully. "Thank you for saying that," she said after a pause. "It takes courage to admit when you've made a mistake, but apologies aren't enough, not if you don't plan to change." Kyle nodded slowly. "I know. That's why I'm here. I want to understand what I did wrong and how I can do better. I don't want to make the same mistakes again." Lisa seemed to soften slightly at his words. "Good, because this isn't just about you, Kyle. It's about everyone who has ever been treated unfairly because of their race, gender, or background. People like me and countless others carry the weight of those experiences every day. And until people like you acknowledge that reality, nothing will change." Her words hit Kyle hard, forcing him to confront truths he had long ignored. He had always prided himself on being fair and impartial, but now he realized how blind he had been to his own biases. It wasn't enough to claim neutrality. True fairness required effort, awareness, and a willingness to learn. Over the next few weeks, Lisa conducted interviews with Kyle and several of his colleagues. Some officers were defensive, insisting they had done nothing wrong. Others dismissed her questions entirely, claiming her investigation was biased against law enforcement. But Kyle surprised Lisa by showing genuine remorse and a desire to improve. During their conversations, he admitted to harboring prejudices he hadn't fully acknowledged before, and expressed a sincere wish to change. "I never meant to hurt anyone," Kyle told her one afternoon. "But I see now that my actions have consequences. Even when I don't intend them to, I need to do better." Lisa appreciated his honesty, though she remained cautious. "It's a start," she said. "But remember, actions speak louder than words. You'll need to prove that you're committed to change, not just to me, but to the community you serve." In addition to the interviews, Lisa reviewed department records, analyzing patterns of behavior among officers. What she found confirmed her suspicions. Systemic issues ran deep within the organization. Officers disproportionately targeted minority drivers during traffic stops, used excessive force in certain neighborhoods, and often failed to document incidents involving civilians of color. While not all officers engaged in such practices, the culture of the department allowed these behaviors to persist unchecked. When Lisa presented her preliminary findings to Captain Carter, he sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "This is going to be messy," he admitted. "People aren't going to like hearing this." "They don't have to like it," Lisa replied firmly. "They just have to listen. Change won't happen unless we address these problems head-on." As news of Lisa's investigation spread, tensions rose both inside and outside the department. Protesters gathered outside the station daily, holding signs that read, "Justice over bias" and "Accountability now." Local media covered the story extensively, sparking heated debates online and in the community. Some residents supported Lisa's efforts, praising her for shining a light on long-standing issues. Others defended the police, arguing that the department was being unfairly targeted. Amidst the chaos, Kyle began attending sensitivity training sessions organized by the department. At first, he went reluctantly, convinced the workshops wouldn't make a difference. But as he listened to stories shared by trainers and participants, he started to see things differently. One particular session stood out, a presentation by a local shopkeeper named Maria Rodriguez, who recounted her experiences with law enforcement over the years. "I've lived in this town my whole life," Maria said, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "And yet, every time I see a police car, my heart races. Not because I've done something wrong, but because I've seen too many people like me treated unfairly. It's exhausting, living in fear of the very people who are supposed to protect us." Kyle felt a lump form in his throat as Maria spoke. He had never considered how his presence alone might affect someone like her. For the first time, he understood the weight of the badge he wore, the power it carried, and the responsibility it demanded. Inspired by Maria's story, Kyle decided to take additional steps toward change. He volunteered at community outreach programs, working alongside residents to build trust and foster open dialogue. At first, the interactions were awkward. Many people were hesitant to engage with him, given his role in law enforcement. But Kyle persisted, listening more than he spoke and showing genuine interest in their concerns. One evening, after a particularly productive meeting, a young man approached Kyle and shook his hand. "I wasn't sure about you at first," the man admitted. "But I can tell you're trying. That means something." Kyle smiled faintly, feeling a small sense of accomplishment. He knew he still had a long way to go, but moments like these reminded him why the effort mattered. As weeks turned into months, Kyle continued to work on himself and his relationships with the community. He attended workshops, read books on racial justice, and sought advice from mentors who encouraged him to keep pushing forward. Though progress was slow, he began to notice subtle changes, not just in himself, but in the way others responded to him. Captain Carter noticed the shift as well. "You're doing good work, Kyle," he said during one of their regular check-ins. "Keep it up. The department needs leaders who are willing to grow." Kyle nodded, grateful for the encouragement. He knew he couldn't undo the past, but he could shape the future, one step at a time. By the time Lisa Grant wrapped up her investigation, Kyle felt like a different person. He was far from perfect, and he knew he would continue to make mistakes along the way. But for the first time in his life, he felt hopeful that he could be part of the solution rather than the problem. And as he prepared to face the verdict in the upcoming trial, he resolved to stay focused on what truly mattered: learning, growing, and making amends. No matter what happened next, Kyle knew one thing for certain: he was ready to move forward. The trial was set to begin, and the town of Maplewood buzzed with anticipation. People gathered outside the courthouse early in the morning, eager to catch a glimpse of Lisa Grant or Kyle Bennett. Reporters from local news stations camped out on the steps, microphones in hand, ready to capture every word spoken by those involved. The case had become more than just a legal matter. It was a symbol of larger issues affecting communities across the country. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Rows of seats filled quickly with spectators, some supporting Lisa's cause, others standing firmly behind law enforcement. Kyle sat near the front, his hands clasped tightly together as he stared straight ahead. He hadn't slept much the night before, his mind racing with questions about what the outcome might mean for him personally, and for the department as a whole. Lisa arrived shortly after, calm and composed as always. She wore a simple navy blue suit that gave her an air of professionalism. As she took her seat beside her attorney, she exchanged brief nods with members of the audience who had come to show their support. To anyone watching, it seemed like she carried no fear. But inside, Lisa felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. She knew this wasn't just about one officer or one incident. It was about exposing systemic problems so they could finally be addressed. When the judge called the court to order, everyone fell silent. The prosecutor began by presenting evidence collected during Lisa's investigation. Charts, graphs, and testimonies highlighted patterns of discriminatory behavior within the police force. Numbers didn't lie. Minority drivers were pulled over at disproportionately higher rates, subjected to harsher treatment, and less likely to receive fair hearings when complaints arose. Kyle listened intently, his face pale as the reality sank in. He hadn't realized how widespread these issues were until now. Each statistic felt like another blow, forcing him to confront the uncomfortable truth about the system he had dedicated his life to serving. Then came Lisa's turn to speak again. This time, she focused not only on Kyle's actions, but also on the broader implications of her findings. "What happened between Officer Bennett and me is not unique," she said, addressing the judge and jury. "It's part of a pattern, a culture where bias thrives unchecked. My goal isn't to vilify individuals, but to shine a light on these practices so we can create meaningful change." Her words resonated deeply with many in the room. Some nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. For Kyle, hearing Lisa describe the situation so plainly made him feel both ashamed and motivated. He understood now why this fight mattered, not just for her but for everyone affected by similar injustices. After days of testimony and deliberation, the verdict arrived. The judge ruled that while Kyle's arrest of Lisa had been unwarranted, his cooperation during the investigation showed potential for reform. Instead of facing severe disciplinary action, Kyle was placed on probation and required to complete additional training programs focused on diversity and accountability. Other officers implicated in Lisa's findings faced varying degrees of consequences, ranging from suspension to termination. For Kyle, the decision brought mixed emotions. On one hand, he felt relieved that he hadn't lost his job entirely. On the other hand, he couldn't ignore the sting of public scrutiny or the knowledge that his mistakes had hurt someone. Still, he chose to focus on the opportunity ahead, to prove that he could grow and contribute positively to the community. Outside the courthouse, reactions were divided. Supporters of Lisa cheered, holding signs that read, "Justice prevails," and chanting slogans about equality. Critics argued that the ruling was too lenient, claiming it let bad actors off the hook. Protesters clashed briefly, their voices rising in anger and frustration. It was clear that the verdict wouldn't resolve everything, but it marked an important step forward. Back at the precinct, Kyle faced a mixture of hostility and grudging respect from his colleagues. Some resented him for cooperating with Lisa, viewing it as betrayal. Others admired his willingness to admit fault and work toward improvement. Captain Carter reminded everyone that change wouldn't happen overnight, but encouraged them to use this moment as a chance to reflect and grow. In the weeks following the trial, Kyle threw himself into the mandated training programs. He attended workshops led by experts in racial equity, participated in role-playing exercises designed to challenge biases, and engaged in discussions with community leaders. These experiences opened his eyes to perspectives he had never considered before. One exercise in particular left a lasting impression. Participants were asked to imagine themselves in situations where they felt powerless or judged unfairly. Kyle found himself recalling moments from his childhood when he had felt misunderstood or dismissed. Connecting those feelings to the experiences of marginalized groups helped him empathize more deeply with the people he served. At the same time, Kyle continued volunteering at community events. He joined cleanup projects, mentored youth, and even helped organize a town hall meeting aimed at fostering dialogue between residents and law enforcement. At first, turnout was low, with many skeptical of the police department's intentions. But over time, trust began to rebuild, thanks in large part to Kyle's consistent presence and genuine effort. One evening, after a particularly successful event, a woman approached Kyle with tears in her eyes. "I want to thank you," she said softly. "My son has always been scared of cops because of things he's seen, but seeing you here, working alongside us, it gives me hope." Kyle swallowed hard, touched by her words. "Thank you for trusting me enough to say that," he replied. "I know I have a lot to make up for, but I'm trying. That's all I can do." As months passed, Kyle noticed subtle changes, not just in himself, but in the way others interacted with him. Neighbors greeted him warmly instead of crossing the street to avoid him. Children waved hello instead of hiding behind their parents. Even fellow officers started asking for advice on how to connect better with the community. Lisa kept tabs on Kyle's progress through occasional check-ins. During one such meeting, she acknowledged his efforts with a small smile. "You've come a long way," she said. "But remember, this is a lifelong journey. Don't stop pushing yourself or others to improve." "I won't," Kyle promised. "And I owe a lot of that to you. Thank you for holding me accountable." Lisa nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Accountability is powerful, but so is redemption. Keep going, Kyle. You're making a difference." Though challenges remained, Kyle felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but he was committed to staying on it. Every interaction, every conversation, every effort to listen and learn brought him closer to the kind of person and officer he wanted to be. By the end of the year, Kyle stood on the steps of the courthouse once more, this time attending a ceremony honoring community leaders who had worked toward unity and justice. As he looked out at the diverse crowd gathered below, he allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. Change was possible. It just took courage, humility, and persistence. And, for Kyle Bennett, that realization was worth everything. Months had passed since the trial, and Kyle Bennett's life had changed in ways he never imagined. The days of avoiding eye contact with community members or brushing off uncomfortable conversations were behind him. Now, Kyle approached every interaction with care, knowing that his actions carried weight, not just for himself but for the entire police department. He wasn't perfect, and there were still moments when old habits crept in, but he was learning to catch himself before things spiraled. The town of Maplewood, too, was slowly evolving. People were talking more openly about issues like racial bias and accountability, topics that had once been brushed under the rug. Community meetings became regular events, drawing larger crowds as trust between residents and law enforcement began to rebuild. It wasn't easy. There were disagreements, misunderstandings, and setbacks, but progress was undeniable. One chilly evening, Kyle attended a neighborhood potluck hosted by Maria Rodriguez, the shopkeeper who had spoken so powerfully during one of Lisa Grant's workshops. Maria had invited officers from the precinct to join the gathering, hoping to break down barriers one meal at a time. At first, Kyle felt out of place among the crowd of families and neighbors, but Maria greeted him warmly and encouraged him to mingle. As he moved through the room, Kyle found himself engaged in conversations he might have avoided in the past. A young mother shared her concerns about how traffic stops affected her teenage son. An elderly man expressed gratitude for recent efforts to patrol parks safely without intimidating visitors. Each story reminded Kyle of why his work mattered, not because it was part of his job, but because it touched real lives. Later that night, as Kyle helped clean up dishes, Maria pulled him aside. "You've done good work," she said simply. "People are starting to see you differently." Kyle smiled faintly, though his cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I'm just trying to do better. That's all I can do." Maria nodded approvingly. "Sometimes trying is enough, just don't stop now." Meanwhile, Lisa Grant continued her mission, traveling to other towns and cities to investigate similar cases. Her report on Maplewood had gained national attention, sparking discussions about systemic racism within law enforcement agencies across the country. While some praised her efforts, others criticized her methods, accusing her of targeting hardworking officers unfairly. But Lisa remained steadfast, knowing that change required sacrifice and sometimes discomfort. Lisa returned to Maplewood periodically to check on the progress of reforms. During one visit, she met with Captain Alan Carter to review updates on policy changes implemented in response to her findings. The department had introduced stricter guidelines for traffic stops, mandatory body cameras, and independent oversight committees to handle complaints against officers. These measures weren't foolproof, but they represented significant steps forward. After their meeting, Lisa decided to pay Kyle a visit. She found him helping organize a youth mentorship program at the local recreation center. Kids laughed and played basketball while volunteers guided them through activities aimed at building confidence and leadership skills. When Kyle spotted Lisa standing near the entrance, he waved her over. "Hey, Ms. Grant," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "What brings you here?" "I wanted to see how things were going," Lisa replied, glancing around the bustling gymnasium. "Looks like you're keeping busy." Kyle chuckled. "Yeah, it's been rewarding. These kids remind me why we need to keep pushing for change. If we can show them what fairness looks like early on, maybe they'll carry that forward." Lisa studied him for a moment, impressed by how far he'd come. "You've grown a lot, Kyle. Not many people would take criticism the way you did and turn it into something positive." Kyle shrugged modestly. "I couldn't have done it alone. You pushed me to look in the mirror, and this community gave me a chance to prove I could change. I owe them everything." Lisa smiled softly. "Don't sell yourself short. Change starts with individuals willing to step up, and you've inspired others to follow your lead." Their conversation shifted to broader challenges facing the town. Despite improvements, tensions lingered. Some officers resisted new policies, arguing they made their jobs harder. Others struggled to connect with residents who remained distrustful. Lisa acknowledged these obstacles but emphasized the importance of persistence. "We're planting seeds," she told Kyle. "It'll take time for them to grow. But every effort counts, even if you don't see results right away." Back at the precinct, Kyle faced resistance from certain colleagues who viewed reform efforts as unnecessary or excessive. One officer, Daniel Harper, often voiced his frustration during briefings. "We're cops, not social workers," he grumbled one day. "Why should we have to tiptoe around everyone's feelings?" Kyle bristled at the comment but chose to respond calmly. "Because our job isn't just about enforcing laws, it's about protecting people. If we lose their trust, we lose our ability to serve effectively." Daniel rolled his eyes but didn't argue further. Over time, Kyle noticed that even skeptics like Daniel began adapting, albeit reluctantly. Mandatory training sessions forced them to confront biases they hadn't acknowledged before, while community outreach programs provided opportunities to form genuine connections. Captain Carter noticed these shifts and praised Kyle for setting an example. "You've earned respect from both sides," he said during a private chat. "That's rare in this line of work. Keep leading by example and others will follow." Despite growing acceptance, Kyle knew the journey wasn't over. There were still tough days when doubts crept in. Late one night, after responding to a tense domestic disturbance call, Kyle sat alone in his patrol car, reflecting on the encounter. The situation had escalated quickly, and though no one was hurt, Kyle couldn't shake the feeling that he could have handled it better. He called Lisa the next morning, seeking advice. "I froze for a second," he admitted. "Old instincts kicked in and I almost ruined everything. What if I slip back into bad habits?" Lisa listened patiently before responding. "Growth isn't linear, Kyle. You're going to stumble sometimes, that's human. The key is to recognize those moments, learn from them, and keep moving forward. Trust the process." Her words reassured him, reminding Kyle that perfection wasn't the goal. Progress was. By spring, Maplewood celebrated its first annual Unity Day, a festival organized to honor diversity and promote understanding. Residents set up booths showcasing cultural traditions, music, and food from around the world. Officers volunteered alongside civilians, working side by side to ensure the event ran smoothly. For Kyle, seeing smiles instead of suspicion on people's faces filled him with pride. During the closing ceremony, Mayor Patricia Ellis took the stage to thank everyone involved. "This town has faced its share of challenges," she said, her voice steady. "But tonight, we stand united. Together, we've shown that change is possible when we listen, learn, and work as one." As applause echoed through the crowd, Kyle caught Lisa's eye from across the park. She gave him a small nod, her expression warm and approving. In that moment, Kyle realized how far they'd come, not just individually, but collectively. They had planted seeds of hope, nurtured them with effort, and watched them bloom into something beautiful. Though the road ahead would undoubtedly hold more challenges, Kyle felt ready to face them. He had learned that redemption wasn't about erasing mistakes. It was about using them as stepping stones toward a better future. And for the first time in years, he truly believed in the possibility of lasting change. For Kyle Bennett, that belief was worth fighting for. Months had passed since the trial, and life in Chicago had begun to settle into a new rhythm. The city was still buzzing with conversations about what had happened, but the initial shock had faded. People were starting to focus on the future, instead of dwelling on the past. For Kevin Doyle, however, every day felt like a test. He no longer wore a badge or carried a gun. Instead, he spent his days at a small nonprofit organization called Bridging Gaps, which worked to build trust between law enforcement and underserved communities. Kevin wasn't sure how he'd ended up there. At first, it had been part of his sentencing, community service hours that would stretch over several years. But as time went on, he realized the work mattered more than he'd expected. He met people who had been hurt by police officers like him, people who had lost loved ones, faced discrimination, or simply lived in fear because of the color of their skin. Listening to their stories made Kevin uncomfortable, but it also forced him to confront the damage caused by his own actions and those of others in uniform. Every morning, Kevin drove to the nonprofit's office, a modest brick building tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. Inside, the walls were covered with posters promoting equality and justice. There were photos of volunteers working alongside community members, painting murals, planting trees, and hosting workshops. It was a far cry from the precinct where Kevin used to spend his days, but he found himself growing accustomed to the change. One afternoon, Kevin was helping organize a community event at a local park. Families gathered under colorful tents. Children ran around playing games, and food trucks lined the edges of the space. It was meant to be a celebration of unity, though Kevin knew not everyone felt that way. Some attendees whispered behind his back when they recognized him, pointing out the former cop-turned-volunteer. Others ignored him completely, refusing to make eye contact. Kevin understood why they felt that way. He wouldn't have trusted someone like himself either. But it didn't make it any easier. As Kevin set up chairs for a panel discussion, he noticed a familiar face walking toward the stage. His heart skipped a beat. It was Michelle Roberts. She looked different today, dressed casually in jeans and a blazer, her hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. Kevin hadn't seen her since the trial, and he hadn't expected to run into her here. Part of him wanted to disappear, to slip away before she noticed him, but it was too late. Their eyes met, and Michelle paused for a moment before approaching him. "Kevin," she said calmly, her tone neutral. "I didn't know you'd be here." "Neither did I," Kevin replied, fumbling with the stack of chairs. "Well, I knew I'd be here. I'm volunteering, but I didn't think you'd show up." Michelle nodded slowly. "I'm speaking on the panel later. Thought it might be helpful to share some insights about accountability and reform." "That makes sense," Kevin muttered, avoiding her gaze. He felt awkward standing so close to her, knowing everything that had transpired between them. "You've done a lot of good work." "Everyone says so." Michelle raised an eyebrow, surprised by the compliment. "Thanks, and you seem to be doing okay too. From what I've heard, anyway." Kevin shrugged. "Trying my best. Doesn't feel like enough sometimes, but it's better than nothing." They stood there for a moment, neither sure what else to say. The air between them was heavy with unspoken words, apologies that hadn't been given, forgiveness that hadn't been asked for. Finally, Michelle broke the silence. "You know," she began, "what happened wasn't just about you. It was about a system that lets things like that happen. You were part of it, yes, but you weren't the only one responsible." Kevin glanced at her, surprised by her candor. "I get that. Still doesn't excuse what I did." "No, it doesn't," Michelle agreed. "But owning up to your mistakes is a start. Not everyone has the courage to do that." Kevin let out a shaky breath. "I don't know if it's courage or desperation. I messed up big time, Michelle. Lost my job, my reputation, my pride. If I don't try to fix things now, I'll never forgive myself." Michelle studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "That's honest. I respect that." The conversation shifted after that, moving away from heavy topics and toward lighter subjects. They talked about the event itself, the turnout, and the efforts being made to improve relations between the police department and the community. By the time the panel discussion started, Kevin felt slightly less tense. Watching Michelle speak, on stage he couldn't help but admire her poise and determination. She commanded attention without raising her voice, her words resonating deeply with the audience. After the event wrapped up, Kevin stayed behind to help clean up. As he packed away folding tables and swept leaves off the ground, he reflected on the day. Seeing Michelle again had stirred up old emotions, but it had also reminded him of how far he'd come. He wasn't the same person he'd been months ago, and while he still had a long way to go, he could see glimpses of hope. Later that evening, as Kevin drove home, he thought about Michelle's words. She was right. The problem wasn't just him. It was bigger than one person, one mistake. But maybe, just maybe, individual actions could spark larger changes. Maybe someone hearing his story, or hers, would think twice before acting on prejudice. Maybe someone would choose empathy over judgment. When Kevin arrived home, Laura greeted him with a warm smile. She could tell something was weighing on his mind, but she didn't press him for details. Instead, she handed him a cup of tea and sat beside him on the couch. They watched TV together in comfortable silence, the kind of quiet that comes from years of shared experiences. The next morning, Kevin woke up early, determined to keep pushing forward. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. Across town, Michelle sat at her desk, reviewing notes for an upcoming report. Her phone buzzed with messages from colleagues congratulating her on the success of the event. She smiled faintly, appreciating their support, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Kevin. She hadn't planned to run into him, but she was glad she had. Talking to him reminded her that even people who seemed irredeemable could change, if they were willing to put in the effort. As the sun rose over Chicago, casting golden light across the skyline, both Kevin and Michelle prepared for another day of work. They were on opposite sides of the fight, yet connected by the shared goal of creating a better future. Neither knew exactly where their paths would lead, but they were committed to taking each step with purpose.